I am here today in my capacity as a consultant and advisor to Hotıì Ts'eeda. And Jessica will speak a little bit about Hotıì Ts'eeda, but it's a health research network in the Northwest Territories, and we've been really excited to help ENR organize the research portion of the agenda this afternoon. So after 2 days of incredible inspiration and wisdom and just exciting presentations, I know what everybody wants to do is delve into ethics and policy, because that's always so exciting. But it was interesting that at the end of the last panel, some of the issues that we want to talk about started to come up in some of the questions from Norm, from Danica Littlechild. And just to recap some of the themes we've heard yesterday and today, Robin did a really great idea of touching on the history of research as a tool of colonization. Research has had a bad name in the North and elsewhere. Sherry talked about parachute researchers. Yesterday, Dana Holtby said, you know, researchers would come in, collect data, leave with the data, and no one in the region would see the data. And certainly I've worked in the NWT since the mid-1970s. I spent a lot of time in the 70s and 80s doing community-based research with the Dene Nation, in Fort Good Hope, a little bit with the Gwich'in and other Sato communities. And we really saw this. We really saw researchers come in, and that was not just with natural environment information, but also data related to traditional knowledge, to community innovation. And at that time, there really wasn't a lot in the way of policies and protocols that would protect how people did research, how researchers would conduct themselves, and what communities could do to get the most out of their own research initiatives. I think we heard this afternoon that the research world has changed a lot. That approach is no longer acceptable. There is a new vision of research, not just as reconciliation, but as a way to assert sovereignty. And I think it's fair to say that at least in North America today, there's pretty widespread understanding of the right of Indigenous peoples to ownership and control of their research and their knowledge. There's a lot of exciting research going on in the NWT. A lot of groups in the NWT are using research to advance their own agendas. But there are a lot of policy and ethical questions. We started to touch on them. And the research world does have its own set of rules. We heard a speaker earlier talk about how some of those rules, like the ARI legislation, actually is in place to protect community knowledge. We also heard a couple of people talk about that co-management of knowledge, that two-eyed seeing, or as we've heard from the Tlisho again and again, being strong like two people. And if we want to create research that does have legs and credibility in both Indigenous ways of knowing and Western ways of knowing, it needs to be done within the context of some of those rules and some of those policies. And I guess the other thing that is becoming really clear is that Indigenous groups, Indigenous governments need to set their own rules to protect their own research and their own creation of knowledge. And when I think of some of the research we did back in the early 80s, really good research, but there was knowledge that was given away or distributed with no protocol, and that's not a good way to do research. So we don't have a lot of time. We're not going to be able to really drill down, but what we'll try to do in the next hour is an overview of what it takes to do research in a good way, some examples of approaches that have been used in the NWT. We want to leave you with some information for follow-up, for advice and support. So we have 3 great panelists. They do have bios in your package, so I'm not going to go through all their amazing background. We're going to start with Alestine Andre, who's originally from around Sigachik and now lives in Whitehorse. Alestine is a former and a long-time heritage researcher with what was at one time the Gwich'in Social and Cultural Institute and is now part of the Gwich'in Tribal Council's Department of Cultural Heritage. Next, we're going to hear from Jessica Simpson. Jessica's a research advisor with Hotıì Ts'eeda here in Yellowknife. And then what are the chances we would have 2 Jessicas on our panel? Then we're going to hear from Jessica Dutton, who is a manager of research ethics and regional programs at the Aurora Research Institute in Fort Smith. And we are going to do what the other panels have done and have all 3 of our panelists present, and then we hopefully will have some time left for questions. So Alestine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Debbie. Drin Gwich'in, Shori Alestine, Andre, Tigechik Gwich'in, Gwich'in Ihli. Today it's a good day. My name is Alestine Andre. I'm a Gwich'in person from around the Tigechik area. Today I'll be introducing a previous work that I've helped carry out with our Gwich'in elders in our Gwich'in settlement area. And so just a little introduction about the Gwich'in Social and Cultural Institute, and then I'll go into some of the research ethics and protocols that we use to carry out our research. Slide? Yes. The Gwich'in Social and Cultural Institute was established in 1992 by the Gwich'in Tribal Council after the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement was signed. And because people were concerned about the decline of our Gwich'in language and culture. So the mandate at the time, the mandate of the GSCI was to document, preserve, and promote Gwich'in culture, language, traditional knowledge, and values. Thus, the GSCI's work was focused mainly on research, education, and language. So as of 2016, a few years ago, the GSCI became the Department of Cultural Heritage under the GTC. The Gwich'in have a rich oral history that is centered on the land. By working with our elders and land users who have an in-depth knowledge of the land, learned from both personal experience and the oral tradition, we documented extensively within the Gwich'in settlement region. Since the early 1990s, we recorded stories and information on approximately 1,000 named places with over 70 elders and land users, and conducted more than 120 research projects. Many multi-year research projects have been carried out working in partnerships with our own people, other First Nations, federal and territorial governments, students, and contractors. And research has focused on the study of place names and traditional land use, ethnobotany, the study of plants, ethnoarchaeology, elders' biographies, genealogy, a Gwich'in dictionary and grammar, the identification and nomination of national and territorial historic sites, and the nomination of the Canadian heritage rivers, the Ngwachonjik or Mackenzie River, and a knowledge repatriation project of 19th century caribou skin clothing. Language and education programs have included language revitalization initiatives, the development of curriculum materials, a language immersion camp, and Gwich'in science camp. And that was a 10-day on-the-land traditional knowledge and Western science camp for senior high school students in the Inuvik area. Research protocols. Initially, GSCI's our experience with research protocol and ethics, it was guided by our Gwich'in elders, whose wish it was to document their stories and knowledge about their traditional way of life on the land. We respected their wish because they wanted to document this knowledge for their great-grandchildren far into the future. So at GSCI, we followed at the time standard research ethics that included meeting with the communities, raising community awareness about our research, individual pre-planning meeting times and dates with elders, and staying in touch with them. We followed interview etiquettes as well, respecting date and time, again meeting with the elders and getting them to set the time for us, and using plain language and using visual aids. Maps were great prompts, as were posters and displays. They really helped to jog the interviewees' memories. And after the research, We continued to keep in touch, sharing available research materials such as the transcripts of the interviews, photographs, maps, reports, online resource, videos, and also we had some information on YouTube, as well as we used Facebook and other publication, as well as online place names. And as always, we reported back to the community after the research work. Key to our research was the interaction between the elders, ourselves, the elders, the land users, and youth. And they provided an intergenerational exchange of knowledge. And also with bringing elders and land users on the land, being on the land itself really helped jog their memory. And we would travel with them by plane, helicopter, skidoo, boat and kicker, and vehicles, and sometimes we walked as well. Not all elders wanted to share their information. We respected their wishes. And some did not want to be tape recorded, so we respected their wishes and took notes during the interviews. Several outside researchers wanted Gwich'in TK, but did not want to comply with the TK policy or the research agreement. One was declined GTC support, and the other we did not hear back from them. Next slide. Confidentiality. It's important to add words about this. Before our interviews with the elders, we suggested to them and land users that we interviewed the option to provide their names in the research we carried out. Overall, our people really wanted to know who provided the traditional knowledge information, their names on the recordings and/or transcripts, and final reports added credibility to the TK provided. And also in the far future, we know that the young grandchildren of the time then will be happy to know that their grandparents, grandmother, grandfather, so-and-so provided the traditional knowledge. And the confidentiality clause was definitely a different matter for medical and social research, which we were not undertaking. The need for the policy, there were situations or challenges that highlighted the importance of having a TK policy. Back in the late 1990s, the GTC office were concerned that Gwich'in TK was published and the authorship and copyright went to a non-Gwich'in organization. So around the same time, too, there was increased exploration and development in the GSR in our area. Therefore, having a TK policy in place made it crucial to the protection and ethical use of Gwich'in TK. In the early 2000s, the drafting of a TK policy was developed with input from all Gwich'in communities, as well subsequent meetings with Gwich'in organizations, co-management boards, and government provided further input into the policy. And there it is. Following extensive consultation, approval in principle, legal review, and final amendments, the Gwich'in TK policy was approved in 2004. The Gwich'in were among the first Indigenous groups in the NWT to have such a TK policy, besides the GNWT. The policy ensures that the collection, the management, and release of Gwich'in TK is conducted ethically, acknowledging and respecting the Gwich'in as its holders. The policy includes a research agreement that must be completed for all research in the GSA, in both the NWT and the Yukon. Some highlights of our research with Gwich'in elders and land users include, it was the elders who recommended other potential elders or other land users who we could interview. They would say, talk to so-and-so. That's their area, that's their land. They will provide you, or they could talk to you about it. Also setting up community steering committees of elders, youth, and land users. Again, those three groups were really crucial to our work. They helped to provide guidance with many of our projects. They were kind of like focus groups, working groups. And another highlight was seeing elders come alive when we brought them out on the land with us, and also coming alive was their memories of the stories, the people, and all the information about the different places where we brought them. And I can't say enough about saying that our elders were always willing to share their knowledge, and they insisted that we recorded their stories so that it could be used and accessed by their great-grandchildren. That was really paramount, I think, that I remember from working with our elders. And also recording interviews in our own Gwich'in language as much as possible helps not only to safeguard the language, but also to safeguard the structure of the way the language is spoken. We've recorded that as well. And sure. Yeah, that's good. So in terms of the lessons learned, I think an important lesson is of ethics and research in the North that we learned is that relationship building is important. Relationship building is important, and that one must recognize that it takes time, respect, and trust. And to end the presentation, as we do not have any proper archival facility in our Gwich'in area, the collection of research material conducted over those several decades, we gifted the material to the NWT archives for preservation and access, and also especially safekeeping until a time in the future when such a facility becomes available in our area. Hain Cho for listening. Merci.
Okay, while Jessica comes up, I'll just say I forgot to note, I told Mila I'm really excited to see how she graphically represents research ethics and policy. So I know she can do it.
Just a clicker, Jessica. Oh, sure, thanks. Okay. Hi, everybody. Jessica Simpson. I'm a project coordinator at Hotıì Ts'eeda. Just a word about Hotıì Ts'eeda. We're a SPORE support unit. SPORE stands for Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research. So basically what we do is we support health research in the Northwest Territories by bringing all the right players to the table. So that includes communities, community researchers, policymakers, decision makers, researchers from university. We try and bring them all together and facilitate good research, or research in a good way. Hotıì Ts'eeda is Klicho. Basically, it means we're together in well-being in mind and spirit. And then when we part ways, we leave each other in a state of grace. So Hotıì Ts'eeda. At Hotıì Ts'eeda, we also have a really broad definition of what health is. A lot of our partners are Indigenous governments, and for them, health includes land and environment. They're basically inextricable from the health and well-being of people. So that's just a word about Hotıì Ts'eeda. The intention of I'm going to speak about traditional knowledge guidelines. One of the tasks that I had to do this past year was a review of ethics standards for one of the Indigenous governments, all the ethical standards that were applicable to their region. And then that just kind of grew to a bit more of an ethical review of other standards that exist in the Northwest Territories. And so what I'm going to present today is what I found. So basically the intention of traditional knowledge guidelines, and sometimes they're called policies depending on which Indigenous government they come from. The whole intention of them is to make Indigenous people stewards of their own knowledge, much in the same way as they are stewards of their own land. Just to give a little bit of a background, some people today have already spoken about how researchers and Indigenous peoples have had really problematic relationships. And one of the places where this was formally recorded was in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And out of that kind of grew the OCAP principles, so ownership, control, accessibility, and possession, which is a program that is run by the First Nations Information Governance Center. But two things about the OCAP principles is that they don't necessarily speak for all Indigenous peoples in Canada. So for instance, it's based on First Nations values, which might not be applicable to Métis or Inuit values. And also it kind of lumps all First Nations groups into one. And so even though they're really good, it's also, you have to keep in mind that not all First Nations peoples are the same and they have their own values. So that's a word on that. Some of the main points, or values actually, when I was reading the traditional knowledge policies, these are the main points and values that came out of all of them. Indigenous peoples are rights holders and not stakeholders, and so therefore they have a right to be self-determining in research, and therefore should have free, prior, and informed consent before any research happens in their region. This is put into action when representational governments are engaged as partners. Also, in the Indigenous knowledge systems, there's an understanding that knowledge can be held collectively by the whole peoples and not just individually. So these policies and guidelines are really important to follow because it tells you how they want their knowledge to be documented, used, and distributed. Having traditional knowledge policies makes space for ownership and control of Indigenous knowledge, and it allows for it to be used by future generations. Before he passed away, Harry Simpson, who was a Gwich'in elder, he said that our oral tradition, once written, will last as long as this land, and if the young people retain this information in memory, they will gain from it. Also, the ethical use of traditional knowledge should put it into equal standing with Western scientific knowledge. When Indigenous peoples are engaged as partners and you take direction from this should naturally fall into place. And lastly, for values, research can be a tool for social equity. So evidence-based policymaking relies on research to inform policy design as well as forecast and evaluate the impacts of policy decisions in everyday lives. So what's in traditional knowledge guidelines? Well, first of all, they define traditional knowledge, which can be slightly different, but they're all more or less the same definition in all of the guidelines that I found. Researcher, I wanted to point out this. In the guidelines, they all define who they consider a researcher to be, and one of the things I wanted to point out here is that that also includes government. And then they also define what consent is. So a lot of them state free, prior, and informed consent, which is something that is also defined in UNDRIP, but the difference between UNDRIP and traditional knowledge guidelines is that the guidelines actually tell you how they want that to be implemented. To be stewards of their own knowledge, these policies and guidelines address how knowledge is documented, used, and distributed. And also they define how they want research to be beneficial for their own community. So what would be the benefits from the project for them? Also, Just to point out, these guidelines should be used with other ethical standards. So for instance, the Aurora Research Institute licensing process, TCPS2 policies, and any self-government and land claim policies. Oh, sorry. I get really nervous, so I always have to read my notes. So right now, the Gwich'in government is in the middle of rewriting their traditional knowledge policies. So if you want a copy of them, you just have to call. They're not online at the moment. They specifically state in this policy that they want these to be read in conjunction with their Gwich'in agreement. So what I'm saying right now are just some highlights of what I found in some of these policies. One of the highlights from the Gwich'in one is that they define who a traditional knowledge researcher is. They also have a definition for who an outside researcher is, but they also have a definition for who an inside traditional knowledge researcher is. And for them, it's someone who is a highly trained expert in their land and traditional way of life. And it takes a long time of listening to the elders and their stories, learning and practicing certain rules to become a TK researcher. They also describe that you'll have to go through a research licensing process with them through their Department of Culture and Lands. They also describe the methodology that they prefer, which is collaborative. And another highlight, or two highlights that I found from this one, is that they describe how they want They describe how to work with elders, so how to care for their physicality, making sure that they're comfortable, making sure that you're using translators, and also how to go back to them to validate your data that you've collected already. And then they also have a section on reporting back to the community, and they prefer that it's done in a culturally relevant way. And to do that, they say that you should work with them on how to do that. Some highlights from the Gwich'in traditional knowledge policy. So in the Gwich'in one, they describe who a traditional knowledge researcher is, and in the Gwich'in one, it's basically the same thing. Is their equivalent is a Gwich'in knowledge holder, and they also say that this is someone that would be recommended to you by a Gwich'in organization. So it's not just anybody. They want you to be able to go to a Gwich'in organization and consult with them, and then they will recommend to you who you should be speaking with. So these ones too also described what they consider to be informed consent. And basically that also consists of working with the Gwich'in Tribal Council or another Gwich'in organization, with a representational organization to get informed consent. Some highlights from the Dutton First Nations traditional knowledge research protocols. They too define who a researcher is, and for them it includes government, and all researchers have to abide by Dene laws, which is something that we heard Dottie talk about yesterday. And I guess one thing that was really, really interesting about this one is that all researchers have to enter a not legally binding agreement. So that agreement, they have a process. The steps here are at the bottom. And actually in their policies, they describe a huge list of policies, and I just kind of condensed it into 5 of them here, just for the purposes of the presentation. But you go through this huge process to come to a not legally binding agreement that actually gets ratified through their First Nations resolution process. They also define how the community should benefit from the research. And then another thing that they explicitly say is that they don't want the knowledge that was used for that one project to be used for all sorts of other projects. They really want all of the knowledge that you gather to be used in context, because we all know that research in the past had taken knowledge out of context and it misrepresents what was being said. And even though they don't explicitly say using a collaborative research method, they do describe that. They do describe a collaborative research method, and those are the steps here. Okay. So how do we know that research has been done in a good way? So these are some, I've read a lot of Julie Bull over the past year. Julie Bull, I consider her, she's from Nunatsiavut, she's Inuk, and she did her PhD dissertation on research ethics. So this is her, these are basically her words, but I've just put them into a nice visual for everybody. She describes these 4 things as how we know research is done in a good way. So the first one is the research has to be relevant. So research that is producing new knowledge should also empower the people because it meets the needs and the priorities of the families and communities. Research is also respectful because you're respecting the community for who they are and what they think. And one way to achieve this is to take direction from the community, follow their guidance from them, and enter into agreements of mutually beneficial outcomes. And also, the research should be reciprocal. So that basically means like you're not just taking knowledge, but you're also giving back in a good way. And the last one is relational. And for me, like in contrast to Western scientific knowledge, I think that this is really key because being relational means that you're putting your research into a context. You're centering yourself in your relationships and surroundings in research. And relational is one of the Indigenous. It's pretty key to Indigenous knowledge systems, so it's in contrast to Western scientific knowledge where you don't necessarily have to center yourself. So putting that in there putting that into research kind of makes sure that you're doing your research in a good way. I also wanted to draw the connection between traditional knowledge policies and UNDRIP. UNDRIP is an ethical standard that I think we more and more need to live up to. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in their final report, they have a bunch of reports, but one of them is called What We Have Learned. And in that, they state that UNDRIP is the framework for reconciliation for all levels and across all sectors of society. So I just wanted to say that because I know when I first thought about UNDRIP, I didn't realize that it was actually one of the things that came out of the TRC. So I just wanted to mention that in case it was lost on other people too. And to implement UNDRIP, I don't necessarily think that we need to go too far or much further than traditional knowledge guidelines, because the guidelines, the UNDRIP, for instance, like defines free, prior, and informed consent and some other things, but traditional knowledge guidelines is how the Indigenous government wants you to engage them and how they want all of that to be implemented. And just to recap, I picked this quote because I thought that it really describes how valuable Indigenous communities are to research. The guidelines presented today are intended to maintain an empowering ethical standard for Indigenous peoples. Traditional knowledge policies and guidelines are in place to deter unethical situations and promote research that is done in a good way and empower communities that they represent as it allows for research to be done on their own terms. So the quote is, and I'm quoting Julie Bull again because she's one of my favorites, without the participation of Indigenous peoples participating in their Indigenous project, they would have no project. And these are just some additional resources in case you wanted to go and find what I've been finding. We also have a handout that is at the resource table that is outside there. Or you can come and talk to me afterwards. I'll be around. Thank you. Masicho.
Okay, and now for Jessica Dutton. And just for those who are trying to take a picture, the links that Jessica had on her last slide are on the Hotıì Ts'eeda handout on the table out by the registration desk. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Debbie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. My name's Jessica Dutton. I work at Aurora College in Fort Smith, specifically in the Office of Research Ethics. So I only have 5 slides. I'm going to be really quick because, frankly, a lot of research policy and administration is very boring. But I do want to I guess just drive home a couple main points that I think will be relevant to this group. And I'm very grateful to have come after my previous speakers and also the last panel, who I think did such a fantastic job of, I guess, illustrating the research environment that we're working in. And I guess just to reiterate that for myself in my work and for Aurora College and the Aurora Research Institute, that is those principles, those best practices, the TK policies, the self-determination in research that so many organizations and Indigenous governing organizations have worked for over the past several decades. That's the standard. That's where we're starting from. So. Okay. So just to note that there are several research policies in place in the territory that are supportive of Indigenous self-determination research, and whether that is, at the level of the band, the First Nation setting their own policies, or through the research licensing process. So there are a couple of supportive, I put rules, because from the researcher perspective, these are sort of the rules that govern how researchers can do their work. And as, a research ethics person, I'm very unpopular. Every research institution in this country has someone like me, or probably more like an office full of people like me, who manage a process of research ethics. And it's designed, when we talk about ethics, I think the previous speakers have done a really good job of talking about ethical conduct of research sort of writ large, and how we can incorporate Indigenous ways of understanding ethics. When I talk about research ethics in the context of my job, it's a very specific, very narrow idea of a process through which we can hopefully require the researchers who work in our institutions to adhere to a set of ethical conducts, values, standards, and guidelines. So I did want to mention the Scientists Act. The Scientists Act is the territorial legislation that set up research licensing. I've been asked by the office that manages research licensing not to talk too much about the research licensing process. The reason is because I don't work directly in their office. I don't know all the ins and outs and the details of that piece of ARI's work, but I'm still going to talk about it anyway because I think it's important, and it's relevant to folks who work with researchers in the territory. And then research ethics review, which once again is part of all research involving humans. And I did want to highlight that that when we talk about TCPS, which I'll get to in a minute, and the standard that researchers have to follow for research ethics, it only applies in circumstances where you're working with humans. So that's a bit of a gap that I think has been identified, particularly in the North, particularly in Indigenous research contexts, because what about people who are not necessarily working with humans, but are working on Indigenous lands, or working, with water, and how do we incorporate the values of water, land, animals, and all of that. So a really interesting aside, Yukon College did a study trying to look at exactly that piece. So if you want to sort of Google that work, it was funded by the Indigenous Reconciliation Grant through the Tri-Council. But so this is to say that the Scientists Act requires you to get a license, and our research institutions require us to go through research ethics review. But also, sorry, I don't even know what's on my own slides. There's research funders are actually the ones who are implementing a lot of the rules that researchers have to follow, which is I don't know that that's necessarily common knowledge, but the people who fund these research grants and that give the money to researchers are the ones that are also requiring them to follow a fairly stringent standard of ethical conduct. Okay, so actually. Oh yeah, here we go. This is a great slide. So research licensing in the territory, just as sort of a primer, it's based on a process of community stakeholder consultation. So the idea is that I'm a researcher, I want to work in communities, so I submit online a plain language proposal to do my research, and then the licensing process will circulate that to various community stakeholders who've been identified based on the region. So if I want to work in Inuvik, it's going out to the band offices, to the mayor's office usually. If I want to do health research, it's going to go to someone who's involved in health in the region. If I want to do research on lands, it's going to go to a Hunters and Trappers Committee or some other organization with who has expertise on lands issues. So the idea is requiring community stakeholder consultation, and to get your research license, it requires this research ethics approval. So this is sort of my very simplified guideline, and I've noted, I've got contact information for Jonathan Michel. He is the manager of research licensing and this process. So if you do have questions or concerns, if you're engaging in research and you want to know, do you require a license, please contact our licensing office. But here's the basics. You want to do research, you need a research license application and a research ethics application. I'm really just saying this because a lot of people conflate the two. But to get your license, you have to undergo the community review process, and you can get your research ethics review with us at Aurora College or elsewhere. Every university sort of has one of these. And then once you've provided a certificate of approval, you can get a research license if you've proceeded through the process successfully. So why does that matter? I've mentioned research ethics a number of times. I've told you that it's a very specific process that researchers go through within their institutions. The important thing about research ethics is that it follows a thick book of standards called the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct of Research Involving Humans, TCPS, and that it has Chapter 9, which is Ethical Conduct of Research Involving Indigenous Peoples. And this is a requirement of people doing research, again, only with humans, but I think as some of the other speakers have demonstrated, the idea has kind of expanded beyond that to require researchers to consult with the communities that they're working with. There's a whole list of conditions under which Chapter 9 applies, and it applies to any research that seeks to draw conclusions about Indigenous peoples. So that's saying if I, as a researcher somewhere in an institution, wants to do research that concludes something about Indigenous peoples in Canada or any specific group, I need to be going through the consultation process from start to finish. So you should be expecting researchers to be consulting from the outset of the project. And even before they go through research ethics, I would argue, because a lot of your input as community members about how they should conduct research, how they should collect the data, how they should manage the data, how they should be in the community, when, how often, all of that goes into the design of their study and their protocol at such a level that the very best, the standard of excellence, is to really be in the community consulting from the very beginning and to co-create these studies. And my point, I guess, because you've heard this, because it's been said, and I think over the last 2 decades, Indigenous organizations, and particularly in the North, have done such a fantastic job of asserting these rights and codifying them in traditional knowledge policies and in research agreements. This is just to say that the research funders and the institutions of research in this country agree and have been and are kind of in their way trying to support, but besides that, there's also best practices and policies. AKINS is a good, I guess, intro primer for folks. If you have, grad students coming in who maybe don't have a lot of experience in this type of thing, point them towards their guidelines. ITK has a strategy for Inuit research. And there's actually tons of them. Lots of Indigenous governing organizations have their own policies around how research is to be conducted. And I think the real value of the work that Jessica and Hotıì Ts'eeda are doing is sort of learning from what other organizations have put forward as their expectations of how researchers engage with them. And that's it. That is my pet pig. And Masicho, thank you for having me.
Well done, team. So we do have time for some questions. Looking around to see if anyone has questions. We have roving mics. Okay, Mandy.
Hi, thank you. My name is Mandy. Oh, Jeremy, whoa. So there's a question in here somewhere for sure, so I'm a PhD student at University of Alberta in the Indigenous Studies program, and there's a couple things I noticed with the conference so far. One is that the research that's being presented, a lot of it really focuses on natural sciences like climate change and soil and animals and stuff like that. That's great. But it's not as much of a focus on social science research. And so that's just something I noticed. But the other thing that I noticed about ethics is that in the context of research, like the academy, the principal investigator, social sciences, humanities research council, NSERC, blah, 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 blah. In that context, all the ethics is directed towards white or non-Indigenous researchers as a way to protect Indigenous communities from like exploitation and intellectual extractionism, right? But there's like a gap in terms of ethics for Indigenous researchers in the academy. Obviously, I know Indigenous people have been researching things forever, but in the context of the Western Academy, now more than ever, there's Indigenous researchers doing research in their communities, and as there's this kind of binary that is implied in all the ethics protocols out there that you're either an Indigenous community member or you're an extractive researcher. And there's not a lot of guidance in terms of ethics for Indigenous people starting to engage in research. So I know that there was a ethics workshop at my school a few weeks ago, and I had a lot of questions that the workshop facilitators couldn't answer because they're more around internal, research internal to nations where there are disagreements about what should be researched and what shouldn't and that kind of thing. So I wanted to speak to that a little bit just as an Indigenous researcher, what I notice about ethics. And one thing I find confusing too about talking about ethics, you say, oh, the community needs to approve this, or the community needs to be engaged, but I'm often who is the community then? How do you define community? And who gets to decide? Is it the chief and council that gets to decide? Or how do you go about figuring that piece out?
Okay, well, we could spend another day on those questions, but I wonder if maybe your last question, Alestine might have had some experience on that, and then your first question, if Jessica has anything they want to say, but we might also throw it out to members of the academy if, Robin or...
Sorry, I actually had a third part of my statement.
Right, let's get through these two first, and then you can do your third one if nobody else has a question. I'm sorry, Mandy.
Okay, thank you. Relating to your third question, community approval, like Jessica, the second, said that research license applications usually go into the communities related to, like, let's say if it's related to land or like any kind of, in our area we would look at research applications if it's anywhere on the land in our Gwich'in area. We would have a look at it, or the GSCI would have a look at it for any kind of TK information. But the same research application would also go to the local, say the Gwich'in councils in our community, and in some cases I notice it goes to the different Hunters and Trappers Association, and also to the RRCs in our communities. We'd get a copy of that. And the RRCs, there's an RRC in almost every community in the Mackenzie Delta Beaufort area. And so, like, I know that in some cases there may be comments or concerns about the research that is being planned or proposed. And so say the RRC will provide their comments about any concerns, and those concerns would go back to the researcher and to address, and to at that point be in direct contact with the say the Ts'eeda RRC, who has a concern about research that's going to be held at a nearby lake or something. So there's a lot of contact between the researchers and the people or different organizations in the communities related to their specific research topic.
And I think, Mandy, maybe what you were getting at was who defines community? Who of those many groups gets to make the decision if there's not consensus? Is that kind of where you were going with that?
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah.
But thank you, Alestine. That
I mean,
makes sense.
And that may be something that every Indigenous government has to include in their policy. I don't know if Jessica wants to comment, and then Danica wants to comment, I think, as well on Mandy's questions.
About who is an Indigenous community, or who is defined as community. When I was reading through a lot of the traditional knowledge policies, they actually define like who they think that you should be consulting with. So for instance, with the Gwich'in traditional knowledge policies, it says you have to consult with a representational organization. So like if you were in Fort McPherson, it would be the Tetlik Gwich'in, or if you were in Nunavik, it might be the Nitat Gwich'in, and for the Clicho, it would be through the Department of Lands and Culture. So like it does say that in the traditional knowledge policies. I just thought I'd say that. Cool.
I just have a quick comment because, Mandy, I'd love to talk to you more about this because it is such a fascinating question for me, this idea of representation, and I think it comes up in a lot of areas of research, but so there's a lot of sort of practical attempts to capture how we do that in policy and through the research licensing process. But for example, in Fort Smith, where I live, there's 2 bands and a Métis council. I can give the example of a researcher who designed a study with folks in town and just a bunch of community members who are interested in sort of, I'll give a vague detail, but they were interested in capturing how this certain type of industry was run traditionally. And she put in the research license, she went through ethics, and one of the bands took real issue with it. And so for the licensing office, I know that was a big problem because, when the process works the way it's supposed to, everyone takes a look, they give their concerns back to the researcher, and the researcher is able to correct them and proceed or proceed with support. But for this individual, it was actually a personal conflict with the administration of one of the bands. So what do you do in a case where there are multiple community leaders, multiple stakeholders that you have to agree to your project, and one of them doesn't like you, doesn't want you to get to do that project, and they know that they have say over this project. And meanwhile, she's saying, I'm working with people in the community to develop it, so it's clearly wanted and needed. So in that particular case, they had to make a judgment call and say, well, it looks like there's broad support elsewhere, but not unilaterally. So, but that question, I think about it a lot in my work, is how we, who says and how we decide. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I so enjoyed this panel, and I was really sorry to walk in late and really miss pretty well almost all of your initial presentation, and I really am sad to have missed that. I blame a toddler. They're very convenient to blame. But I wanted to ask, because it was so interesting to me to hear the kind of phrasing that you guys used, and even the way things are drafted in your presentations. I think sort of that level of sophistication in terms of connection to the Western sort of methodologies of research ethics and the vocabulary that's used in Western methodologies really told me that there's probably been a lot of issues with researchers coming and usurping and appropriating and everything. And so there's been this need to create a fairly comprehensive and leak-proof set of policies that are cognizable, are understandable to non-Indigenous researchers. So I thought that was a really important takeaway for me. But the other side of the coin for me, though, and I guess as sort of an Indigenous person now in the academy, I'm sort of wondering whether you guys have ever had to engage in like actual Indigenous protocols around access to knowledge. So I'm not talking about like written in English saying, talk to this research officer, do X, Y, Z, but I mean like protocols that are set by the Indigenous legal orders of those peoples in particular about how you access information about a particular plant, for example. There may be like, I'm thinking of where I'm from, if you want information about a particular plant, there's a very specific process to go through as an Indigenous person to acquire that information, which requires the fulfillment of a number of our protocols within our own legal system, and how we are able to sort of quote unquote disseminate that information is sort of set also by those protocols. And so I'm sort of thinking of like the Indigenous systems, not how they're interpreted through the lens of sort of Western institutions, but rather like the systems themselves. And I don't know if I'm being articulate enough, but so to me, like that's a really interesting thing, because one of my big efforts as a practitioner was to elevate Indigenous legal orders, and I think English, this is where English sort of breaks down for people, because it's so hard to articulate what I mean by that in English, right? Because you're stuck with the vocabulary that you have. But of course, in Indigenous languages, it'd be so much easier to be able to explain what you mean about like the protocols and access to knowledge and that kind of thing. And so I think like, so that I'm just sort of wondering if you've ever had to deal with that in the context of the work that you guys do respectively, and maybe it is with Indigenous researchers, or maybe it's with non-Indigenous researchers as well, like whether the actual Indigenous protocols around access to knowledge and how it's used are ever employed, or if they're seen as something that's really separate from these types of processes. Like, is it just considered sort of separate and apart and only engaged in specific circumstances, or is it something that people are thinking about when they're also in these processes?
So, Alestine, I wonder if some of the work you did on ethnobotany might allow you to comment on that?
Yes, thank you for your question. My master's thesis was in traditional plant medicines, so I spent almost many months walking on the land and with my teacher, who is also a Gwich'in plant person. And so there were times, I think, when there were a few plants pointed out to me that she just nodded and said that such and such a plant, and it's very sacred in our for our people, for our old people, she says. So, so in those cases, I knew that not to take down any notes or to take any photographs. So that kind of thing happened personally with me. But also as an Indigenous researcher and working with our elders those couple of decades, 20 plus years, there were times too when we sat down with elders and there was some information that was sensitive. And so they did tell us that it was sensitive and to turn the recorder off, or you don't need to record this, it's just for your information. So I think that we respected and went along with it. But also on a personal note, myself, I know that, and with other Indigenous people in the room, we know that the information, some information that we have within our own group, it's sacred medicine, and it's not anybody has privy to that to that information, and an elder will know when you're ready to receive that information, and it's based on the way you live and the kind of interests that you have, and it's the way they see you living. Then they'll give you that information. No other time, it might be too early, but the elders knew the kind of information to provide to me when, on a personal basis. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're over time. We could probably take one more question, and it'll be Mandy's number 3 if I don't see any other hands, because this is the last one. Oh, Lex, you want to ask a question? Okay.
It's super fast. It's much easier to answer than the other one. So, I mean, in terms of ethics, obviously the ideal situation is for Indigenous nation or community, what have you, to, you know, say this is our research need. Can any researchers out there, you know, support that? Is there a mechanism at Hotıì Ts'eeda or ARI or something for communities to articulate that and put it out there so that researchers can see what the wishes are and like act appropriately?
That's great, because not only is it super fast, but it was going to be our closing comments. So I'll let Jessica 1 and Jessica 2 answer.
Thank you, Mandy, for your question. Yeah, there is a mechanism at Hotıì Ts'eeda. So that's actually what we do, is try, like, we are here to connect researchers with communities, but that's also the other way around, to connect communities with researchers. And we do that by regularly trying to review what some of the research priorities are of communities. I don't really like saying that word, communities, but like community organizations, Indigenous governments. We have an annual gathering every year where we disseminate some of our project, what do I call it? It's kind of like it's an annual gathering, and it connects researchers and communities together to talk about the different kinds of research that is happening. So that's one of the mechanisms. Invite only, so better get on the guest list. And one of my jobs as a research advisor is I get a lot of people coming to me to get advice on how they should go about their research. And I do refer a lot to traditional knowledge policies, but I also go a lot by what my knowledge is of the North and Indigenous communities. And Jessica, too.
Thanks. I would say with ARI, there's no formal mechanism, and I think it goes back to the question of representation. The approach our organization has taken has been to direct researchers to the community organizations, and I think Jessica included on her handout of resources, there is a link to TK policies, or to research policies in general for some of the Indigenous organizations that have them, where you can, read what some of them might be a bit old, but at some point, some organizations had put together a list of priorities and research issues. But yeah, I think Ts'eeda has done a really good job of stepping in to fill that kind of gap.
Okay. No, we're done?
No? Okay,
Okay,
darn.
one more comment.
Oh, okay. I actually just have a couple of thoughts. One, like when Indigenous community, like I guess it can be an Indigenous researcher or a non-Indigenous researcher, but like when they're trying to do research in Indigenous communities, access to information, it's Indigenous people really want to see that you're a really trustworthy person. And so building relationships is really, really key to doing good research. I just thought I'd mention that. And the Indigenous communities or in governments will tell you whether or not you're doing a good job at that, and they'll tell you how they want it to be done. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Okay, great. We obviously could go on, and maybe we need another whole conference on this, but just a reminder, there is a handout, some of the links that all of our panelists spoke to. There's information there, and we also included in there, the last 2 days we've heard a lot about the Coast Fund. We included a link to the Coast Fund's monitoring framework, because they have put a lot of thought into developing indicators that were co-developed by Indigenous and scientists and funders. And for people here who are thinking of doing this work, it's a really good starting point. So thanks to our panelists, and Kathy, I think we